Hello, listeners, subs, and those of you who haven't subscribed. Welcome to the latest installment to our series about the wicked vileness of slavery. This series, I'm dedicated to Florida and any other backward state that fixed their abominable mouths to say slavery was beneficial to those called Black Americans. You are truly worthless. Let's continue. Question. Why are some states working so hard to rid this country of Black American history? What other ethnicity or group? Can you think of any other group history they're trying to obliterate? Are the atrocities committed against those called Black American that great, shameful, and disturbing? As they say, you can run, but you can never hide from the blood stains on your hands and your ancestors' hands. You know, the ones you guys seem to praise and worship for every vile thing they did in the name of finding a country that was already found by those who look like me and other groups. Some of y'all want to believe that every single person in slavery came from Africa when that is false. Think about it. Think about the vessels they used to transport at that time. Do you know how long it would have taken to bring millions of people from Africa to America? And you know how many took their own lives and jumped in the ocean or the sea to escape the vileness they knew was in store for them? It's just not possible to transport that many people by vessel to this country from Africa. That's why they want so hard for us to believe that the majority of people who look like us came from Africa, because they know we're native. And by us being native, do you know how much larger that makes the debt they owe us? That's why it's always a problem. They can pay everybody else because they don't really owe them that much. But they literally owe us this country and probably half of the world. Let's continue. Another question. How many people can tell which state in this union was worse than any other states when it came to slavery? Can you tell? At this time and age, can you tell which state in this country was worse than any other state when it came to slavery? I can kind of tell by the way some of these people in power that was passed on to them through generations and just plain old nepotism. You could tell by their demeanor and attitude how that state was when it came to slavery. Some might think, well, that's far-fetched. That doesn't really mean anything. Of course, you would say that. Let's continue. The sexual exploitation of enslaved people was a facet of enslavement in Virginia that took many forms for both men and women. Enslavers sexually assaulted and abused enslaved individuals, demanded reproduction from them to enhance their own bottom lines, and otherwise use the bodies of the enslaved for monetary gain, pleasure, and punishment. Don't it seem like they're still doing the same thing? Western culture's objectification and sexualizing of black bodies exacerbated the sexual vulnerability of enslaved men and women. In addition to being detrimental to the well-being of enslaved people, sexual exploitation strained marriages and other interpersonal relationships valued by enslaved people. The historical record speaks to the ubiquity of mixed-race sexual relationships in the era of slavery. Virginia had the largest number of mixed-race enslaved people of all the southern states, totaling approximately 44,000 in 1850. While some of these sexual relationships were long-term, and some enslaved men and women navigated sexually intimate relations with their enslavers and other white people in an effort to survive and secure better treatment. Historians question whether any relationships under such an unequal power dynamic can be considered consensual. No, it can't. Because anytime those enslavers or overseers or what have you got angry, they sure did let them know. Put them back in their place real quick. What? You said you not what? Oh, okay. I could ship you to one of those plantations that's deeply, deeply hidden in the South. Keep playing with me. I guarantee you they threat every opportunity they had. They threatened those people, those men and women. To prove that point, look what they do now. How many of you people, Black Americans, those called Black Americans, know people, white people that you've been friends with for years or worked with for years? How's that attitude when you step on their toes? When you say something or do something they don't like? Aren't they quick with the tongue? Like completely forget you guys were supposed to be friends or work friends. You know what I'm talking about. Let's continue. As it was elsewhere, sexual violence was a ubiquitous component of enslavement throughout the history of slavery in Virginia. Enslavers exercised almost complete control over the bodies of enslaved individuals and the conditions of their existence, providing themselves with numerous avenues for force and coercion in the intimate lives of the enslaved. The plantation culture itself, with its strict hierarchy of white male authority, emboldened enslavers to demean and dominate those over which they held power, and the law provided enslaved people with no protection from sexual violence. The sexual assault of an enslaved woman was not a crime under most state laws. In George versus State, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled in 1859 that a black enslaved man could not be convicted of raping or sexually assaulting, for those with delicate ears, an enslaved woman because it was only a crime to commit sexual assault upon a white woman. If they could still rule that way, they would. I'm sure some do. Because of this absence of legal protection, historians lack an archive of legal cases to determine the extent of sexual violence against the enslaved and must rely on other evidence. For enslaved women in particular, slave narratives speak to the ubiquity and constant threat of sexual violence and at the hands of enslavers, their family members, overseers, and others. As Harriet Jacob wrote, "My master was to my knowledge the father of 11 slaves. But did the mothers dare to tell who was the father of their children? Did the other enslaved dare to allude to it, except in whispers among themselves? No, indeed, they knew too well the terrible consequences." Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861. Reverend Israel Massey, who was born into slavery in Empuria, recalled that enslavers and overseers would send husbands out on the farm, milking cows or cutting wood. Then he gets in bed with slave himself. Some women would fight and tussle, others would be humble, feared of that beating. Elizabeth Keckley, who was born into slavery in the Piedmont region of Virginia and taken by her enslavers to North Carolina, told in her narrative behind the scenes, Our 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, 1868, of being repeatedly sexually assaulted by the son of a wealthy plantation owner who lived nearby. Eventually, she gave birth to a son that he fathered. Indeed, the sons of enslavers often repeated the patterns of sexual exploitation they learned on the plantation. In 1826, 2 students at the University of Virginia sexually assaulted a 16-year-old enslaved woman and later stripped her naked and beat her for giving them a venereal disease. as recounted by Alan Taylor and Thomas Jefferson's Education, 2019. Women were not the only ones who faced sexual assault. Jacobs noted that in addition to sexually assaulting enslaved women, enslavers did in some cases exercise the same authority over the male slaves. In 1787, an incident in Maryland, an enslaved man was sexually assaulted when he was forced at gunpoint by two white men to sexually assault a free black woman. As with enslaved women, fighting back was usually futile, as those who resisted would be whipped or sold to a plantation in the lower South, separated from their families and consigned to a life of even harder labor. Nonetheless, some enslaved people did resist, self-emancipating, fighting back, or in extreme cases resorting to the murder of their abuser. I don't know why this country likes to paint the picture that slaves were content, docile, and did whatever these corrupt-minded people wanted them to do. They don't tell you about the stories of how many revolts there were, how many plantations and farms were burnt down, and how many families were, taken out. They don't want to tell you about that. Western culture's objectification and sexualizing of black bodies contributed to the sexual vulnerability of enslaved men and women. Black women had long been depicted by early European travelers as especially fertile and hypersexual, a view that was carried over to enslaved women to justify sexual contact without consent. Both enslaved men and women endured violations of their bodies and a general lack of consideration for their privacy. They were scrutinized, groped, and objectified by enslavers. At slave auctions, black women were sometimes paraded with their bodies exposed to advertise their potential to bear children. Stripping enslaved people to whip them was a common sexualized humiliation added to corporal punishment. In addition, enslaved people often were provided with inadequate clothing, and this exposure contributed to their vulnerability. I got the answer that I was asking in this the last series I did, talking about black men being sexually assaulted in slavery. I was asking because they were talking about how slaves were often walking around a plantation naked. And I was like, why the hell were these adults and children walking around a plantation naked? It was a part of keeping them vulnerable. Not, where you gonna go? If you don't have any clothes, what can you do? You gonna run around town? You gonna run away naked? How you gonna get where you need to be naked? It was a invisible chain along with the physical chain, keeping them naked so they can't run away. And then also they wanted them naked because they lusted after their bodies. Pervertedly lusted after their bodies. Let's continue. Traveling in 18th century Virginia, Fondre Jean de Chetlut recorded seeing young Negroes from the 16 to 20 years old with not an article of clothing, but a loose shirt descending halfway down their thighs, waiting at table. Enslavers had a financial interest in enslaved people's reproduction, as children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's enslaved status. This natural increase, as it was termed, enriched slavers' bottom lines. Nowhere was this more so than in Virginia and other states of the European South, and other states of the Upper South, where a large enslaved population, the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, and a declining agricultural sector combined to make it profitable for enslavers to sell their surplus slave labor to the booming cotton states of the Lower South. In 1832, during a debate over slavery in the House of the Delegates, James H. Golson of Brunswick County compared enslavers' right to the increase of their enslaved women to that of the owner of broad mares, and noted that this increase consists of much of our wealth. You hear that? I don't even know if I said this man's last name right. James H. Golson of Brunswick County compared enslavers' right to the increase of their enslaved women to that of the owner of broad mares, and noted that this increase consists of much of their wealth. You know, we talk about generation wealth and where they got it from, but they want to swear up and down they work hard. My great-grandparents came here with half a shoe, and one of the laces on the shoe was broken, and 10 fingers are almost broke, and hip bone was out of its socket, but they still made it. They still built our family a fortune. Only thing they worked hard at was standing in them lines when those racist government politicians was handing them out land free of charge and money and slaves to go with that land. No other group in this country worked as hard as those called Black Americans. You can get mad all you want to. Show me proof. If you can show me proof that there's other groups in this country that has a history of working harder or as hard as Black Americans and went through the same identical thing that our people went through, then hey, you won that. You might have won the battle, but you ain't won the war. Let's continue. During the same debate, Thomas Jefferson Randolph noted that 8,500 enslaved people were exported annually from Virginia to the Deep South, and said, "It is a practice and an increasing practice in parts of Virginia to rear slaves for market." Historians disagree about how systemic forced reproduction was, but it is clear from oral history and other first-hand accounts that enslavers did engage in the practice. James Green, who was enslaved in Virginia, recalled that his master chooses the wife for every man on the place. No one had no say as to who he was going to get for a wife. All the wedding ceremony we had was the master's finger pointing out who was whose wife. Will Ann Rogers remembered that her mother, who had been enslaved in Virginia, told her that her owner mated slaves like stock. Sam Everett, enslaved in Virginia, recalled that if there seemed to be any slight reluctance on the part of either of the unfortunate ones, Big Jim would make them consummate this relationship in his presence. He noted that this brought sadistic pleasure for the enslaver beyond the profits to be gained. He enjoyed these orgies very much and often entertained his friends in this manner. Quite often he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. This is about to make me just reading that, just, oh my God. You see what I say? And I'm going to keep reiterating until I just don't want to do it anymore. What they say or how they talk so badly about Black Americans, so condescending, demeaning in every form and fashion. They're actually telling you or calling Black Americans what they are. Can you imagine what they did so freely and loosely to those people that was put in trains? Just look at the mentality today. Look at the sadistic, barbaric, over-sexualized mentality today, with all these rules set in place, all these laws set in place, supposedly to help and protect everybody, but we already know. But just think about all the laws and rules that are set in place today, and look what they still do and get away with. Imagine what they were doing when there was no law set in place protecting those called Black Americans who were in chains and sold like chattel. Okay, let me continue. I just want to reiterate again, seeds planted, they will be reaped. So whatever you willingly chose to plant, just know one day it's going to come back. You're going to be looking around for somebody to have some mercy. And it's going to be some Black folks that they ain't even going to know what mercy means. I'm just giving you a heads up. You can take it or leave it. Let's continue. Enslaved women were commonly referred to in terms that reduced them to their reproductive capacity. Massey recalled hearing enslaved women sold at the local slave auction being referred to as a fine wench or a good breeder. Similarly, some enslaved men with imposing physical builds were used as stockmen to impregnate a number of women with no regard for family connections. One slave recounted being forced to reproduce with 15 women and father dozens of children. Many enslavers may have been content to let enslaved individuals make their own mate choices, but even then there was still coercion at work. As an enslaved teenage girl reached adulthood, she would have been aware that settling on a partner of her choice relatively quickly was better than having a choice made for her, and that women who failed to reproduce were devalued substantially and often sold away from their families. Enslavers encouraged enslaved women to bear children in subtle and not so subtle ways. Many provided pregnant and nursing women with extra rations and reduced workloads. Some were known to make small presents to enslaved women when they had a baby. In 1792, a Virginia enslaver named B. Talbert promised an enslaved woman named Jenny that he would emancipate her and her sixth child if she would bear him 5 children, which according to Deborah Gray White, he did in 1803. Long-term relationships between enslavers and enslaved people occurred throughout the era of slavery. As historian Brenda Stevenson noted, these relationships ran the gamut from sexual assault and sodomy to romance, from chance encounters to obsessions, concubine, and even marriage. Historians have argued about whether any of these relationships, even ones characterized by a degree of choice and tenderness, can be called consensual within the confines of slavery. Although not all white male, black female relationships were exploitative, argued Deborah Gray White, most began that way and most continued that way. For many enslaved women, acquiescing to the sexual desires of their enslavers was the best among several bad options, including being physically punished until they relented or being sold off if they continued to refuse to submit. Some women made peace with their situation, knowing it would result in better treatment, such as working in the house as a domestic servant for themselves and their children. Harriet Jacobs entered into a long-term relationship with a neighboring white man to stave off to stave off the repeated advances of her despised enslaver. Some enslavers held out the reward of manumission for favored concubines and their children, although the death of the enslaver or the vagaries of the plantation economy could thwart such promises. What is certain is that such relationships were extraordinarily common, as noted from contemporary recollections and from the high percentage of mixed-race people in the antebellum South. As diarist Mary Buchan Chestnut recalled of the enslavers around her, like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children. And every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own she seems to think drop from the clouds, or pretends so to think. As Brenda Stevenson notes, based on an analysis of the 1850 U.S. Census, Virginia had the largest number of mixed-race enslaved people of all the southern states, totaling 44,299, or just over 10% of the enslaved population. Light-skinned enslaved women, who were themselves the product of mixed-race couplings, were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation. Light-skinned women could be caught up in the fancy trade, catering to men who purchased these women as concubines. I don't know why I keep saying concubines. Concubines. Wait a minute. Concubines and prostitutes, often selling for as much as skilled male laborers. Emily Russell notes Stevenson was an enslaved girl who was placed on the market for $1,800 in 1850 by the Alexandria-based slave trading firm Bruin and Hill. Wow, that just threw me. That just had my head spinning. Alexandria-based slave trading firm Bruin and Hill. They had a slave trading firm. Destined for sale as a prostitute in New Orleans. White women also engaged in sexual relations with enslaved men. As with enslaved women, some light-skinned men often found themselves the particular target of such sexual exploitation. Richard Hinton, a white abolitionist, testified to the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission that he had never encountered a light-skinned formerly enslaved man who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have connection with them. As Thomas Buckley found in his analysis of divorce in antebellum Virginia, roughly 9% of Virginia's divorce petitions from 1786 to 1851 were from interracial adultery, with 23 of those petitions coming from white men who complained about their wives' relationships with black men. Peter Nielsen, traveling in Virginia in the 1820s, recorded that he had learned about a planter's daughter having fallen in love with one of her father's slaves, had actually seduced him. Wow. Now you see the tension between black and white men and black and white women. It goes deep, don't it? It goes deep, doesn't it? The 1825 divorce case of Virginians Dorothea and Louis Bourne illustrates white women's agency in initiating intimacy with enslaved men. Neighbors and friends testified that Dorothea Bourne had long pursued a relationship with Edmund, a man enslaved by her neighbors, the Richardsons. Judith Richardson testified that Bourne was often seen lurking about her Negroes' houses, and others testified that they believed Bourne had several children by Edmund. Notably, these witnesses did not express shock, suggesting that such interactions were not uncommon. Some of these things I'm reading was said in my series talking about black men being sexually assaulted by white women and white men. But it goes along with the article and the research that I found. So just bear with it. You're still learning something that this country doesn't really want to talk about. They'll talk bad about folks who look like us, but they want to keep quiet when it comes to their dirty, filthy laundry. Let's continue. Sexual exploitation was but one weapon used by enslavers to keep enslaved people subordinated and degraded. Enslavers benefited in many ways from the violations of black men's and women's bodies, including through physical and emotional gratification, reaping the power of victimizers, and the monetary profits associated with the reproduction of the enslaved. I have so many conclusions at this point doing this research. I don't even know where to start, but I will start. And excuse me, I just, during the recording of this vid, I noticed my voice I thought it was going to clear up, but it's a little hoarse. When my voice gets hoarse like this, it means I'm just really tired. I've had a hectic 3-4 weeks and I still haven't really rested like I need to. But let's continue. What I do, one of my definitive conclusions is slavery was the most vilest and abominable thing that any one of us could ever imagine. You know, white folks love documenting everything. And yes, I said white folks. From things I've read and researched, it was widely known how many enslavers kept full records, aka diaries, of their deep, devious, dark discretions. I see why some are working day and night to try to bury this here terrible part of their disgusting history. But you can't hide anything. Someone with a conscience will always be around to shed light on what you try to bury. Plus, it's up to us to keep it going. Keep talking about it, exposing this filth. Don't let anyone cover it up. It needs to be dealt with properly. White folks, you want black folks to stop talking about your deplorable behaviors, past and present, like what took place, the world saw happen in Montgomery, Alabama. You want them to stop talking about it? Leave us alone, release what you hoarded and stolen from our people, and move your ass out of the way for once and for all. But you will still reap every seed you and your despicable ancestors have sown. You shall do that. Well, that will be it on our latest installment of the deplorable vileness of slavery. I'm gonna get a name. I'm trying to think of what kind of name I can give this series. Exposing slavery. You know, to those who say that slavery benefited black Americans, sometimes I could just, I don't want to say it. But thank you for your time and attention. To those who have not subscribed, I appreciate it if you will show your support by subscribing if you want to. I'm not going, I'm not trying to force you, and I'm for sure not going to beg you. But if you choose to subscribe, I thank you in advance. If you don't, hey, I'm just glad you took the time out. I appreciate you taking the time out and listening to this video. Have a great day. Be safe, and God bless you, and stay tuned and look out for my next video. I don't know what it's going to be about, but I'll probably do another video on this vileness of slavery. Until then, be safe. Thank you.